Welcome to Reading Inspires by Reading is Fundamental. I'm your host, Dr. Erin Bailey. This podcast celebrates the power of books and the joy of reading. In each episode, we talk with educators, librarians, families, authors, and literacy champions to explore one big question: what does reading inspire for you? Through stories, research, and real-world experiences from classrooms, libraries, and homes, we explore what literacy looks like and why it matters. Whether you're nurturing young readers, shaping learning spaces, or simply love a good book, we're glad you're here. Let's get inspired. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Jennifer Scoggin and Hannah Schneewind, founders of Trusting Readers. Welcome. And they also have this book, Trusting Readers. Oh, there you go. Powerful practices for independent reading, which I will be sure to link in the show notes below. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'd love if you would each start with just a bit about your journey into literacy, what drew you to teaching, and how did this eventually lead to you writing the book, Trusting Readers?
Okay, great. Well, first, thank you for having us. We're so excited to be here and to get to talk to you about some of our favorite things. But I come from a family of teachers. So my mom was a teacher, my uncle's a teacher, lots of people in my family. So I grew up in an elementary school classroom hanging up bulletin boards for my mom. And then I was lucky enough to have some really great professors in college, despite the fact that I said I'd never go into education. I took an education class and got hooked. And so out of college, I started teaching in Harlem, New York. I taught first and second grade. And I think a lot of it is luck. I worked with some amazing colleagues. I had this really fantastic principal who encouraged me to pursue my doctorate. And so I did that. And then I met more fabulous and interesting people who introduced me to Pam Allen. Pam Allen was my mentor for a very long time. She guided me into literacy consulting and taught me the ropes. And so I made that next step. While I was there, I was lucky enough to meet Hannah. And Hannah and I began talking and collaborating a lot first as consultants. And then it naturally made sense for us to start something together because our conversations led us to the ideas that are the basis of trusting readers. But I'll let Hannah talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so like Jen, I actually started off teaching first and second grade. I was teaching in Brooklyn, New York, and I was lucky enough to teach at a wonderful school full of absolutely fabulous teachers. So as a brand new teacher, when I was struggling with something or I didn't know how to do something, I would walk next door and I would knock on Connie's door and I would say, "Hi, may I watch as you do your independent reading, or may I watch as you do writing workshop?" And Connie would say, "Of course." And then the next day I would go to the other side and ask that person. So I taught there for 10 years, and I was just so lucky to have so many fabulous teachers from whom to learn. I had a professor in college who always told us, you can decide that you want to teach 25 students to read, or you might decide that you want to teach 25 teachers to teach 25 students to read. And she said, both are fabulous. I had always kind of carried that with me. And so after being a classroom teacher for 10 years, I decided I did want to go ahead and work with adults. But I was really lucky because after doing that for 10 years, I went back to the classroom and taught first grade for another 5 years. So I think one of the things that is so fabulous about teaching is that it's very flexible. You can be in the classroom, you can be out of the classroom, you can have different roles, and they're all really interesting.
I
And I
really
think for
love
Hannah and
that.
I think when we were all those experiences, just to get to what led us to trusting readers in particular, I think all of those experiences led us to see that at times there is a level of mistrust, just systemically, like trusting teachers to be able to do the work of teaching 20, 22, 25 individual people how to grow as readers. There's a lack of trust that independent reading is enough, that it is robust enough to support kids as they're on their journey to read. And then the idea that we can't trust students like actually want do the work without a lot of hand holding, that they want to do that. And we saw that repeated kind of unconsciously, not intentionally, but over and over and over again. And that we kept having the same conversation about this idea of trust. And that's what really led us to write the book and then to start our own consulting group.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that so much. I mean, certainly I've been a teacher in the classroom and faced those issues of trust. And I think we see that a lot now, for better or for worse, with a lot of mandates and scripted curriculum. And, I've had this conversation with many colleagues that some teachers, they appreciate scripted curriculums because they really want to focus on their teaching, the art of teaching itself. So not having to go out and write their own curriculum takes away one burden for them. Whereas others, myself included, are a little bit more on the creative energy side. They want to write their own curriculum. So having these kind of mandates of you have to follow the page by page guides leaves us feeling a little stifled and with less creative outlets that we wanted when we went into teaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you talked a little bit about this, but you started this organization, Trusting Readers. What were those core needs in literacy education that you were hoping to address through your organization?
Well, we knew that after we wrote the book, we really wanted to partner with schools in ways that emphasized independent reading. I think in both our professional experience working with teachers as consultants, but both in the classroom, like you were saying, it feels like there are a lot of different ways that teachers approach teaching, whether it be you'd like the curriculum feels safe for you, or the curriculum is something you want to write yourself. The research on independent reading there's just too much of it. It's just too clear about how beneficial it is for children. We also see it as beneficial for teachers because it allows us insight to see how our students are doing when they're actually applying all those skills and strategies to something that has meaning and purpose in their mind. So, we really wanted to push that agenda in schools to really to promote that message, and then to support teachers in feeling like it is enough. This is what you do. This is what it does. This is what your kids can do inside of it. And while we were doing all that work in schools, this idea of reading identity was something that we were interested in, but just like sparked all kinds of conversations with teachers. We'd go to conferences and it was a piece of our presentation, but all anyone wanted to talk about. Or when we were in classrooms and we mentioned it, it really seemed to resonate with people in a way that we weren't anticipating. We were excited about it, but this idea of really thinking through both the cognitive and the affective, like the skills and strategies and the emotional part of teaching, really resonated. And so we spent a lot of our energy on looking into that, both from the research standpoint and like, what does that mean in terms of practical application in the classroom to make reading instruction better? And so from there, our work kind of took on a new direction. We started talking about it and presenting on it. And it felt a little bit at times in recent years, kind of in contrast to some of the scripted mandates that teachers are facing, that they didn't feel as if there was space for that. It felt like there was a tension. And so naturally our work has morphed a little bit into some of the pre-K space, where teachers are looking for more support, but there's a little bit more freedom, and people want to have that foundational piece of like, what does it mean to grow someone who's confident enough to tackle something that big at that age? And so now, in addition to working in elementary and middle school classrooms, we're spending a lot of time in pre-K classrooms. Hannah's in pre-Ks in New York. I'm in a nonprofit nature-based pre-K outside all
Fun.
day with little ties. And that's also brought us into work with other nonprofits like Read to Grow, that's based here in Connecticut, that's focused on getting books into the hands of parents and caregivers. So it's a long way of saying that this idea of reading identity has really brought us into classrooms in new ways. It's changed the way we research and talk at conferences. It's brought us in front of parents and pre-K teachers, and really has kind of taken on a life of its own in our work and our organization.
Amazing. I want to join your outdoor nature program. That
It's
sounds like fun.
amazing.
Hannah, your philosophy emphasizes trust. Can you unpack trust a little bit for us, and why is trust so central to your approach?
Sure. So when Jen and I first were working with teachers and then doing research for our book, we heard from teachers a lot that even though they knew the importance of independent reading, they were always a little concerned about doing it in the classroom. They were afraid that an administrator would walk in, and to an administrator, it might look as if they were just sitting on the floor next to a child or they were just sitting with two children having a conversation. In reality, what had happened was that the teacher had very explicit plans about what she was teaching those students. She had looked at data, she'd looked at what she had taught them previously. She was being very clear about what the students needed and what she could teach them. But it didn't necessarily look like that from the outside. So that's when we started realizing, oh, wow. So that's kind of one crisis of trust, which is that administrators have pressure put on them, and then they in turn might put pressure on teachers inadvertently. And so then teachers didn't necessarily trust the admins to see what was happening. And then it led the teachers to not necessarily trust their students. So again, the teachers knew that independent reading was so important. They felt as if they had to have a lot of accountability measures, like you have to write a certain number of Post-its in your book, or you have to fill out this reading log, even when they sometimes knew that maybe kids were faking it. But they felt as if, oh, well, can I really trust my students? And again, all of this is inadvertent, but it just is what we noticed was happening. And so we trust teachers, first of all. Teachers have an extraordinary amount of expertise, right? Teachers keep up with all the research. They follow their curriculum, or they follow standards. They know a lot about children's literature, and they know the students in front of them. So we trust teachers' expertise to make those decisions. We also have to really trust the students. So Jen said we do a lot of work in pre-K. I will talk to 3 and 4-year-olds. They have a lot to say about what they want to read. You know, they have favorites. They have books they don't like. They have books they think are boring, and they're 3 and 4. So we also have to trust that no matter what age students come into our classrooms, they have a lot of opinions about themselves and what they want to read. And so we need to trust their view of themselves. We need to trust their opinions about reading. And we need to trust that at independent reading time, they really are reading. So trust plays through a lot of aspects of this work.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Hannah, if you can also share a little bit about independent reading, because that is the topic of your book. What is it? What does it look like in the classroom? And what does the research say about independent reading?
So if you are in a room of 100 teachers, 100 researchers, and you say, what is independent reading? You are going to get 100 different answers. And so that's why I love your question so much. There's no agreement about what it is. So that's why in Trusting Readers, Jen and I actually start the book by defining independent reading. And so we define independent reading as using the principles of time, choice, talk, and teacher support. So children need time to talk about books, right? I always get a little nervous if I'm in a classroom and the classroom is too quiet, right? That's weird. Kids want to talk about their books. They do need to be able to choose what they want to read. And when we talk about choice in independent reading, we are really talking about guided choice. So it's not that you could choose literally anything. We do need to support kids so that they are choosing some books that they can read with accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. And then they're choosing other books that they just want to read because they're interesting. They love them. They heard another friend read them. But again, the teacher is very involved in that. They do need a lot of teacher support. So that's one of the misunderstandings that we find about independent reading. So we always say independent reading without teacher support is not independent reading. It's kids with books. And kids with books is also important, right? We know that there's some students who don't have access to books at home. That's why your organization is so important. But independent reading really is an instructional time. And so the teacher is very involved in independent reading. So it is that time plus choice plus talk and then teacher support that really make independent reading so important.
Thank you. That's so helpful, Hannah. And I think what I'm noticing is it's that word independent, even that people have various definitions of. So as you're describing, independent reading is not children just sitting by themselves and the teacher. And I think there's some models out there in which all the children are reading and the teacher is reading by themselves too. And what you're saying is not that. It's that the teacher during this independent reading time is actually teaching as well. And there's a lot of thought and planning that goes into it to meet each student what they're working on in their individual reading needs during that time.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, exactly right.
Great. So let's chat about the book a little bit. So your book, the title, which again I'll link in the show notes, "Trusting Readers: Powerful Practices for Independent Reading," has resonated with so many educators. What was the reason that you wrote this book together, and what impact has it had, and do you hope that it will have?
I can't imagine writing anything without Hannah. So I feel like the two of us at this point, we share a brain essentially on these things. So for the two of us, I mean, again, it's so feeling so passionately about independent reading and wanting to give I think to see independent reading as central and not an afterthought. I think that's another thing that we saw over and over is that independent reading would happen when there was time left over from all these other
Mhm.
things that needed to get done in a literacy block rather than that being the central piece. And the other instructional tools, which are very important, like small group instruction, the read aloud, shared reading, whole group instruction, all of those things are very important, but they are all in the service of independent reading rather than it being an afterthought. And in the schools in which we worked, we saw that shift start to happen and teachers I think it's trusting independent reading, but also sometimes trusting themselves, like trusting themselves, and that trust may have been taken from them for various reasons, just to trust, like, oh, I can do this. Like I can inspire my students to do that when they aren't reading, because it's not just because you say it's time to do independent reading doesn't mean they're all going to magically do it. That we are able to create an environment or a community where the kids do want to do that when we put those principles in place that Hannah was talking about. So we do feel like that has been a really positive impact on students in classrooms. And the other thing I think in our book is that it was very important to us that independent reading and the way teachers implemented it and the way that they talked about children was incredibly asset minded. So when we're looking at independent reading in a classroom, knowing it will not go beautifully the first, that's insane. Like, of course, it's not going to go like you snap your fingers and it's like a picture perfect. But that the way to create that community is by noticing what it is your students are doing, what they are interested in, where they do exhibit strength, and building upon that. And that's where we had a lot of success. That's a shift from a lot of schools which are encouraged to look at data. And of course, data is important, but a lot of those data conversations tend to be deficit oriented. What aren't students doing? Where do we have to bring up our data, our numbers? And I understand why that conversation happens in that way when you're looking at numbers. But when you're looking at kids in a classroom, to say, oh, well, they're not reading right now, they are not able to sit at their desk is not necessarily, it doesn't give you a pathway to changing that. So what is that child doing? How can we name that strength to build their personal confidence, to change the kind of the air that we're breathing during independent reading and to bring everybody into community around that? That's been, I think, one of the things that's made us the happiest and seeing that as our contribution.
Yeah, thank you. It's maybe surprising for some of those who are listening, but you share this stat in your book, and it's also one that literacy coach shared with me when I taught first grade. But there are many, many classrooms in this country where children are reading a book for less than 20 minutes a day. Imagine that. And then think about if there's a child in a situation where they don't have books at home or they don't have a space in their home where they can read. That means they're also not reading at home. So their entire reading is happening for less than 20 minutes a day in the classroom. I think it is our responsibility as educators to provide a space and a time for children to sit down and read. And I've noticed this, there's a lot of shift to whole group instruction. And not saying that that's a bad thing. Of course, we need to do whole group instruction, and it's very effective. But you have to think, if you're instructing children to do something, when are you giving them the time and the opportunity to actually practice what it is that you are teaching them?
Exactly right. If they don't get to ever put those skills, when we're really into acquisition of skills and introducing kids to skills, whole class, one, does everyone need what that skill is in that particular moment? And then two, if they don't apply it independently and kind of transition from that place, like I'm going to practice this thing, but now I'm going to put it into practice independently. Those are two very different, that's a big shift for kids. So you're exactly right.
Yeah, and that's where your concept of trust comes in, because it's easy to sit everyone down and do a whole group lesson and say, okay, I hit this skill because I
Right.
taught it, but then releasing, and we talk about a gradual release of responsibility. The word release is key there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Releasing children and trusting them to be able to practice and apply that skill on their own does take trust and time. Like you said, you don't snap your fingers and it happens. You may even start, I would say, 2 minutes a day. You're thinking your very young readers, kindergarten, first grade, how long can they sit and read a book independently, and start small, I would say.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So Jen and I also say quite frequently that we like to live in the world of and. That is to say, sometimes there's a dichotomy in education, and people feel as if you are either teaching a whole lot of phonics or
Mm.
you are giving them independent reading, right? You're either teaching whole class or you're doing all small groups. And it's a both and. Of course, whole group instruction has a lot of merits, and students also need that tailored, personalized instruction. Of course, we know that children need direct instruction in phonics and fluency and decoding, comprehension. And there's also a lot of research about the role of choice and motivation and engagement. And so one of the reasons we do trust teachers is that it's really only the classroom teacher who can figure out in their classroom how to do both over the course of a day and a week.
And I would add on to that to say all that instruction absolutely has a place. These are all tools that we're calling upon because reading is complicated and kids are complicated. So we need a robust set of tools. But with accountability in mind, since that's such a big consideration in education, we really think that the only way to be held to account, to see that that instruction from whatever, if it's whole class, small group, however you're delivering it, the only way for us to know that that instruction is working is to see it in independent reading. It is not to test it in discrete ways. Again, that serves a purpose to have an exit ticket or to ask kids to write a short paragraph or to do a fluency test. Those things have merit. And when we don't see those transferred into independence, when kids are reading something that they feel is purposeful, you have to question whether or not like that was actually taught to independence or just taught to kind of to jump through a hoop. And so that we also see independent reading as like the ultimate assessment of how well our instruction is sticking. And then that's how we can decide, do I need a whole group? Do I need a small group? Do I need one-on-one? Is based on that kind of assessment.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a key point there. It's more than can a child read, it's do they want to read as well. And that's something that you can measure if you're interested in quantifying it through independent reading. Is it something, and you talk about this in your book and you share some rubrics for evaluating, is a child motivated to read? How do they describe themselves as a reader? What kind of books do they gravitate towards? So I think that that's the can and want to are two different sides of the same coin. So I want to transition. We talked about class reading in the classroom, independent reading. A lot of families listen to our show as well. So I'm wondering what are some practical tips you can give to families who want to cultivate joy and independent reading habits with their children at home?
It's a great question. And we are so excited to expand into the parent space. Like that's it's such a joyful time when we get to work alongside caregivers who really are like, they just want to see their kids love to read. I've never met a caregiver who isn't really invested in that. So, and you said it beautifully, is that we really believe a caregiver's essential role is to create that foundation of joy. We think as teachers, often we think of the foundational skills as phonics, phonemic awareness, like all of these skill-based. We would argue that the real foundation is love and joy of reading and seeing reading as purposeful. And if you don't have that real foundation, it's hard to build skills upon that because kids don't see the purpose behind it. So that's where parents are huge support systems for teachers and schools. And just a few, one of the things we do, we talk to parents about how can you have a cost-effective home library? Where does that library live? Having books on a shelf versus like, where are the places in your home where you can scatter books? So it's kind of woven into the fabric of your day versus like this formal place that, exists only at bedtime. Even though bedtime's great, there are lots of times and reasons to read throughout the day. We talk to parents about different routines for building kids' vocabularies. How is the conversation that you have around the dinner table and the back and forth with your kids? How can you use that to build up the vocabulary and the conversation that helps kids make meaning inside of books? We talk to parents about following your kids' natural interests. To guide you towards what kinds of books and what kinds of reading do you have in your house? Is it an audiobook? Are you nonfiction? Do you have magazines? Like, how do we diversify what it is that your kids offer? And a lot of times we spend time with families talking about how do you take an exhale when it comes to the anxiety you might feel about making sure that they're ready to learn how to read at school and really maybe de-emphasize let's work on letter sounds and names, and we've got to be sounding things out. And instead, like, how can we take a more playful approach towards like rhyme and alliteration, and a playful stance that builds all of those beginning skills. So that's a lot of the practical stuff that we do with families and caregivers.
I love that so much and guilty of all of those. There isn't a room in my house that doesn't have books in it. And I really appreciate also what you mentioned about diversifying what we conceptualize as reading. And I'll give some examples of what I do with my own children. Of course, I have books all over my house.
Same.
They're coming out of everywhere at this point. I get them sent to me all the time and I share them with my children. But recently we also started reading magazines. So Riff had a partnership with Storytime magazine, which is based in the UK. And so now I've been able to expose my daughter to magazines. We also have something called a Yodo player, which is considered a screen-free device. It's storytelling. So oftentimes before bed, my daughter and I will listen to folk tales and fables, which are meant to be oral storytelling in nature, on this Yodo player. And then, of course, ebooks. I know a lot of families out there are very weary of screen time, but the research is now showing that if you treat ebooks the same way as a print book, there are equal benefits to reading ebooks as print books. So Riff has a ebook platform called Skybrary. It's a award-winning platform, and I've been using that with my own children for years. As they get old enough, the recommendation is not screen time before age 3. I also have a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, so we're not quite there yet. But with my daughter, she very much enjoys Skybrary, and we can do the same types of things that you would do with a printed book. Talking about the characters, looking at the problem and solution, asking some questions along the way, talking about our favorite parts. All of those things that we do with our printed books, we can do with our ebooks too. So I just wanted to share some examples for families out there who are looking for ways to diversify their literacy approaches in their house. And a lot of these can be cost effective too. You can rent books from the library and have them audiobooks or onto your Kindle or other devices like that too.
And that's great. Those are great suggestions. I mean, even especially if you travel a lot or in the car and you have a middle kid who's always waiting for the older kid to finish some sort of sports practice, or, you're at the dentist or they're waiting. I mean, an ebook is an easy way. I mean, I think we grab it, grab our phone, but handing an ebook or talking over an ebook, it is the same as having a book in your purse. And also audiobooks. I think some families are wary of an audiobook. Does that count as real reading? My child likes to listen. And we know audiobooks, like the work that our brains are doing. No, you're not doing the decoding work, but your brain, in terms of the comprehension, the research is showing us you're doing all that same work to make meaning from that text. And so that's another great way for kids to access books. And you're right, like, you can do audiobooks like through Prime, but you can also the app Libby or all of our public libraries, they have great free ways to do that. And that's reading too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love those examples at the dentist when you're waiting at sports practice for your other kid. And it's true. I've spoken with other parents about this, and even on the podcast spoken about this. It is difficult for children to wait sometimes. And I think in our society, the tendency is to open up our phone and pull up YouTube, but why not a book? For those parents who are transitioning, just challenge yourself. Maybe swap out one ebook or audiobook for a YouTube video per day. I think you'll be amazed with the benefits that you will see.
100%. And I would also if you are a parent of a young child and you can't take the music, do you know what I mean? Like the Jump Jump Johnny Giraffe or the wheels on if you've just had it with that music, those audiobooks at the library, you pop that in, you can in the car ride. I mean, that saved my sanity. But also, I think what you're talking about, though, the bigger concept is creating a habit of reading. Reading is a habit. It is a habit that we have to practice, to turn to a book in those moments of downtime when we're eating a meal, when we're alone, before bed. And so you can't start early enough with kind of modeling those habits and then practicing those habits together so that they can compete with all the distractions that we have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I also would just like to add that when I work with parents, I always talk to them about you read to your child in the language that you feel the most comfortable in. Sometimes parents are thinking, well, I want my child to learn English. Do I need to be reading them in English? No, learning 2 languages, growing up with 2 languages, we know is so phenomenal for our brains. That is such an asset to have. And so please read to your child in whatever language is most comfortable for you. That's so important for our children who are growing up bilingual, multilingual.
That's an amazing point, Hannah, that I try to emphasize all the time as well. And what I want families to realize is a lot of the skills that your child is learning, they transfer from language to language. So things like book handling skills, concepts about print, even the flow, story structures, narrative story structures, beginning, middle, end, problem, solution, character, setting. those all transfer from one language to the next, most almost all of the time. So it's great for building those early literacy skills that they will need when they get to school. So going back to the book, you have four components of independent reading: time, choice, talk, and teacher support. Can you walk us through why each of these elements matter, and especially how choice, because that's critical to RIF's mission as well, works alongside the others to create such a meaningful and sustainable independent reading experience?
Sure. So I mentioned a few of these before, but each one of these components, it's important to know, is backed up by a lot of academic research, as well as being backed up by what we call the wisdom of practice, right? Teachers who are in the classroom. So students do need uninterrupted blocks of time to read. We know that there is a correlation between how much students read, how long they read, and how good they get at reading. And so we need to be able to provide that time in school. It can't be something that the teacher is able to kind of move in if she has 5 extra minutes. It can't be something that is only done on Friday. It really needs to be a regular part of the schedule. So choice, we know, again, the research behind the connection between choice and engagement and motivation is huge. One of the questions we often get from teachers is, how do we motivate our students? How do we engage our students? There's so much happening in the world and there's so many distractions. Well, giving students choice is really one way to do that. Talk, as I mentioned, it's odd to me if classrooms are quiet. So think about yourself as an adult. When you see a movie, what do you want to do? You want to turn to the person next to you and say, can you believe that just happened? Or, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? Right. And so kids are the same. I love it if in the middle of reading, I'll see, a first grader scoot over to her friend and say, look at this really gross part. You have to see this disgusting thing, you know? Or I have kids who will be reading something and then will jump up and say, oh my gosh, you won't believe what just happened. Like kids want to talk and share. And so they need time to talk to their peers. They also need time to talk to you, because you, as the teacher, can be a model partner for them. You know how to have really sophisticated conversations. And then, as we mentioned, there is that teacher support. I can't say it enough times that one of the biggest misunderstandings of independent reading is that it is just kids reading. And Erin, you referred to this. There was this thing called drop everything and read. And the idea behind it was that everyone in the school building would be reading. But we know that that is not actually impactful, that you have to have the teacher there being really involved at all levels, from how to choose books to what strategies are you using as you're reading, as you're actually reading and decoding, to how to read fluently, to what do you do at the end of a book. So there's teacher support at all levels.
Yes, thank you for sharing that part.
Yeah, I could talk about that for a really long time, so
Yeah.
I'll stop now.
I think the key there is the teacher is teaching during independent reading time. And if you've ever seen a classroom where independent reading is done very well, there's often a teacher who observes first. And I think you talk about this as kid watching in your book, and making notes maybe on a clipboard of what each student needs to work on during their reading. That way the teacher can pull and have a conference with the reader while the other kids are reading. And talk about
Absolutely. And I
that.
think that's a way to be really intentional about it and to diagnose what we were talking about earlier, to say, oh, is this, someone's doing this well, but this isn't, they might need support here. Is that for this one student, or there are three students? Do I need a small group, or is it really the whole class? Like, really, that independent reading time is where you start to see those patterns emerge. And that's how you figure out how to build your instruction during that literacy block, is based on what needs are emerging and how frequent are those needs? What are the patterns?
Yeah, seeing patterns, almost like a detective. That's what I loved about being
Mhm.
a reading specialist is it was a little bit like playing detective. If you can figure out what it is that a child needs to work on, then you have all of these research-based strategies that you can use to meet the child at the individual skill or need that they are working on.
100%. We always say that teaching is equal parts teaching and research. You need to be doing the teaching, the work of teaching and exposing and supporting and whatnot, but then also waiting and watching and researching students to let you know what's next. So it's like a very reciprocal process, like a detective. I like that. I like that analogy. Yeah.
So I want to transition just a little bit to talk about the connection between reading and writing. You
Mhm.
both recently did a webinar for us, which I'll also link in the show notes about using mentor texts, which are author written texts, to mentor children in their writing. How do you see reading and writing as connected? And from your experience, how does being a strong reader help someone become a strong writer?
That's a great question because we do call ourselves trusting readers. We talk a lot about reading. We also very much love writing. We love talking. I think writing with kids sometimes is just spectacular. It's very fun to write with and alongside kids. Um, my mentor, who I mentioned earlier, Pam Allen, once said that reading is like breathing in and writing is like breathing out. That they're very much related to each other, and that when we have kids who are readers, they're getting exposed to how language works, like on the sentence level, like how does a sentence sound? What is a, how do you end a sentence? What does a story sound like? How do people present information? Why might they do that? Kids are getting exposed to all these things that readers do that give them a sense of possibility. I want to tell you two quick stories, even though I know I talk too much. There's two stories. So one is from the pre-K world. Right. So we think of pre-K and the connection between reading and writing. So for several weeks in this pre-K room, we had been reading aloud wordless books and looking at these heavily illustrated books and kind of telling that story. So kids, when they were reading those wordless books, were getting the practice of telling the story themselves. So they got that feeling of what is it like to tell a story? What does a story sound like? Because if kids can't really say it or tell it, it is much harder for them to commit that to paper, to write it. So that oral language piece is really, really important. So we had read and read and read all these words. It blew their minds that books don't have to have words all the time as little 4-year-olds. And this little peanut, Graham, came in on a Monday and was like, he held it up like a tray. He was like, I wrote a book. And he was like, I'm an author. And we had read so many, we had told so many, and then he went home and he did an art project with his grandmother and he wanted to write that. And he told this story and the idea that he saw that this is how people share stories of their experiences. And then he was inspired to say, I can do that too. It was possibility. And then from there, the kids, everyone in the room is like, well, Graham can do it, I can do it. And so everybody is writing these wordless books. And then naturally someone's like, well, I'm going to try adding words to mine because all these books that you're sharing with us do have words. And so it just became this process where they were really inspired about what's possible. And then when we have like fifth graders, this is a story of my son, who is a very reluctant writer. He's very invested in the question, is a hot dog a sandwich? This is a big question in fifth grade, right? And so there's a lot of debate and argument. And he had recently completed a unit of study with his teachers at school around argument. And they had read a lot of argumentative essays, they had read a lot of opinion pieces. And he realized through reading them that when something is important enough to you, you can share that in writing. It adds a level of, I don't know, like oomph to that like thought that you've been having for such a long time. I know it's a hot dog sandwich debate, but he on a weekend and wrote this whole essay and brought it to school. And then there was just a debate. It was off and running. And his teacher didn't have to do, because she had done all the work with them as readers, the work as writers was like that much easier. Maybe she wanted them writing about something more robust than the sandwich, but like I don't think ultimately that's what mattered to them. So that's how we see in real time all of that work as readers, really kind of inspiring writers to see possibility.
Absolutely. I love that story so much, a hot dog sandwich. And I think it speaks to choice too, right?
Mhm.
Maybe the teacher had wanted them to write something more robust, but the point is, were they able to meet the standards of argumentative writing? And if it was through a hot dog sandwich argument, then they met the standards, right? It is it something that choice gave your son an in into the writer that he was going to become.
Right. I mean, it wasn't, how do we conserve water? But it was, you're exactly right. He was excited about it. It got other kids excited. And it started with reading. So,
And I
and a
just want to
passion for sandwiches. I don't
repeat that quote
know.
that you said too, because I loved it so much. You said it was from your mentor, Pam Allen. Reading is
Yeah.
like breathing in and writing is like breathing out. That it resonates with me so much, especially when I was working on my doctorate and writing my dissertation.
Yeah.
I was always writing in the evenings. That's the only time I had to write was after I put my daughter to bed. And there were some nights where I felt so exhausted that I thought, I'm only going to read tonight. I just need something more restorative. I'm only going to read. But somehow, miraculously, kind of like your son, I would start reading and something would spark for me. And suddenly I would be writing and writing and writing. So it is a breathing in and breathing out process. They are always interconnected.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, it is like you were saying earlier about for families creating a habit of reading. And I think the same stands for writing. Ralph Fletcher, who is also another brilliant teacher of teachers, said that not all readers are writers, but all writers are readers. And so, if we can also think about what are the ways that writing can feel purposeful for our children, like what are ways that get them excited so that they have a habit of writing, like you're saying, you were almost processing the information you were taking in as a doctoral candidate and trying to put it together and understand it through your writing, right? Like it was inspired, but you're also trying to kind of wrap your head around some like these big ideas. And that's a habit that's a really lovely habit to create for students, whether it's journaling or writing a dissertation. There's a lot of space in between there too.
Yes, so absolutely. We will transition here. Speaking of reading to inspire you, as you know, this podcast is called Reading Inspires. So I always end by asking our guests, what does reading inspire for you? And Hannah, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I am very lucky because I grew up in a family of readers. And when I think about reading, what I really think about is how I am always inspired by connection and characters. So when I am reading, I am there with the character. We always say to children, put yourself in the character's shoes. But I did that before I knew that that was kind of a thing we were supposed to do. So I will cry when something bad happens to the character. I will cheer when something good happens. I will yell at the character when they make a bad decision. So for me, it is really all about that connection to characters. And I always respond really emotionally to books. So when I taught first grade, I never could read the end of Charlotte's Web aloud.
Oh
There's
God.
something there's something about reading aloud that brings the emotions to the surface. And I remember like my 6-year-olds looking at me and saying, Miss Schneewind, are you crying? And be like, nope, I'm not crying. We can read this. It's fine. But again, it's that connection to characters. That's what I always hold on to.
Absolutely.
And I would say it's about connection for me too. I think Yes, I also cry every time I read I don't know if we have ever talked about that, Hannah, but I also cry every time I read that. And Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge
Oh,
by Mem. I
always.
can't read
Yep.
it out loud. But for me, it's always about reading is about connecting to people in my life. So if someone is recovering from an illness, I'll send them a book. My friends and I are always sharing books. I'm always interested in what other people are reading. And I think that has created conversation and connection amongst friends. Um, like I mentioned, my kids are now in seventh grade and 10th grade. I think reading maintains a connection between us. I just recently stopped reading out loud to my daughter at night, and she's a 10th grader. Um, that is a place of connection for us. And now it's about sharing books and reading them side by side. And so for me, reading is always about connecting with the people who are most important in my life.
Well, I'm sure that was very bittersweet. As someone who has a 5-year-old daughter, that'll be me someday, and I'm sure that will be a bittersweet moment.
Yeah.
But connection, reading inspires connection. I think I heard that throughout our conversation today, and maybe the word independent reading is a bit of a misnomer because it really is about connection. Because how do you build trust? It's through connection, teachers' connections with their students. Thank you so much, Hannah and Jen, for sharing with us today. And thank you, everyone, for listening to Reading Inspires by Reading is Fundamental. I hope today's conversation sparked new ideas, meaningful connections, and a renewed love of reading. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with a fellow literacy champion, and join us next time as we continue exploring what reading inspires.